In the beginning, there were only 7 hills rising from the marshes beside a winding river, where shepherds grazed their flocks and farmers scratched furrows in volcanic soil. No one could have imagined that this modest settlement would one day command the Mediterranean, that its eagles would march from Britain to Mesopotamia, that its name would become synonymous with civilization itself. Yet the seeds of that greatness were planted here, in mud and blood and the stubborn determination of a people who refused to accept the limits that geography and circumstance seemed to impose. The inhabitants themselves never forgot that their city was born from violence. They told the story of Romulus and Remus, twin sons of the war god Mars, abandoned as infants on the banks of the Tiber and suckled by a she-wolf until shepherds found them and raised them as their own. When the brothers grew to manhood, they quarreled over where to found their city. Romulus favored the Palatine Hill, Remus the Aventine. The gods sent signs, vultures circling overhead, but the brothers interpreted them differently. In the end, Romulus killed Remus and built his city where he chose, declaring that anyone who dared leap over its sacred walls would die as his brother had died. The story was myth, but it captured something essential about the local character: the capacity for both fraternal loyalty and fraternal murder, the willingness to kill rather than compromise, the understanding that power required both divine sanction and human violence. Whether or not a she-wolf actually nursed abandoned twins, the citizens believed that their city was founded in 753 BC through an act of sacred fratricide that established both the inviolability of their boundaries and the price of challenging their authority. The historical reality was probably less dramatic, but no less significant. Archaeological evidence suggests that small communities on the various hills gradually coalesced into a single settlement during the 8th century, influenced by the more sophisticated Etruscan civilization to the north and the Greek colonies spreading along the southern coasts. The inhabitants absorbed techniques and ideas from both cultures, while developing their own distinctive approach to governance, warfare, and social organization. The first rulers were those 7 legendary sovereigns whose names echoed through civic memory long after monarchy itself had become a hated word. Romulus, the founder, established the basic institutions of urban society: the Senate of Elders who advised the sovereign, the citizen assembly that approved major decisions, and the system of clientage that bound wealthy patrons to humble dependents through mutual obligation. His successors built upon these foundations, each adding elements that would persist throughout the Republican and later periods. Numa Pompilius, the second ruler, was remembered not as a warrior, but as a lawgiver and priest-sovereign who established the religious calendar and rituals that regulated civic life. He created the College of Pontiffs, who interpreted divine will, the Vestal Virgins who maintained the sacred fire, and the complex ceremonies that ensured the gods' favor for the growing city. Under Numa's influence, the people developed their distinctive understanding of religion as a contractual relationship with the divine. If humans performed the proper rituals with meticulous precision, the gods were obligated to provide protection and prosperity in return. Servius Tullius, the 6th sovereign, transformed local society through a comprehensive census that organized citizens according to wealth and military service. His system created 5 classes of citizens, each with different equipment requirements and voting power in the popular assemblies. The wealthiest citizens, who could afford full armor and weapons, received the greatest political influence, but also bore the heaviest military obligations. This arrangement links citizenship to military service and political participation to material contribution, establishing principles that would define civic life for centuries. But it was the last monarch, Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, whose arrogance and cruelty created the hatred of monarchy that would drive political development for the next 5 centuries. Tarquin ruled without consulting the Senate, used violence to suppress opposition, and treated the citizens like subjects of an oriental despot rather than members of a civic community. His reign demonstrated to the populace the dangers of unlimited personal power and the necessity of institutional constraints on executive authority. The crisis that ended monarchy began with a single act of violence that crystallized years of accumulated resentment. Sextus Tarquinius, the sovereign's son, raped Lucretia, the virtuous wife of a prominent nobleman. According to the story that became fundamental to political mythology, Lucretia summoned her husband and father to witness her shame, declared that no woman should live to cite Lucretia as a precedent for surviving dishonor, and killed herself with a dagger. Her blood called for vengeance not just against her attacker, but against the entire system that had made such injustice possible. Lucius Junius Brutus, who would become one of the Republic's founding heroes, seized upon Lucretia's sacrifice to organize a revolution. He carried her bloodied body through the streets of the city, calling upon citizens to witness what monarchy had done to their wives and daughters. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The people rose in revolt, drove out Tarquin and his family, and swore a collective oath that no individual would ever again wield supreme power in their community. The revolution of 509 BC was not just a change of rulers, but a transformation of political consciousness. The populace did not simply replace a bad sovereign with a good one, but abolished monarchy entirely, creating in its place a system designed to prevent any individual from accumulating the power that had enabled Tarquin's tyranny. Instead of one ruler, they chose 2 consuls who shared executive authority and could veto each other's decisions. Instead of life tenure, they established annual terms that ensured regular turnover in leadership. Instead of hereditary succession, they created competitive elections that made political advancement dependent on popular approval and peer recognition. The Senate, which had served as an advisory council under the monarchs, became the primary governing institution of the new republic. Composed of former magistrates with lifetime tenure, the Senate provided continuity and institutional memory while remaining formally subordinate to the elected executives and popular assemblies. This delicate balance between aristocratic expertise and democratic legitimacy would prove both the republic's greatest strength and its ultimate weakness. The popular assemblies inherited from the monarchical period were reorganized to reflect the new political realities. The Comitia Centuriata, based on Servius Tullius's military census, elected major magistrates and declared war and peace. The Comitia Tributa, organized by geographic tribes, passed most legislation and tried important legal cases. The Comitia Curiata, the oldest assembly, retained certain ceremonial functions related to family law and religious matters. Together, these assemblies ensured that political decisions required not just elite consensus, but popular participation. Yet the early republic remained under constant threat from enemies who sought to exploit its apparent weakness. The Etruscan ruler, Lars Porsena, allied with the exiled Tarquin, besieged the city in an attempt to restore the monarchy. The siege produced legendary heroes whose exploits became central to civic education. Horatius Cocles, who single-handedly defended the bridge over the Tiber until it could be destroyed, then swam to safety despite his wounds. Mucius Scaevola, who attempted to assassinate Porsena, was captured and demonstrated local determination by burning off his own hand in the enemy's presence, declaring that 300 youths had sworn the same oath and would keep trying until they succeeded. Whether these stories were literally true mattered less than their function in defining civic virtue. They established the expectation that citizens would sacrifice themselves for the Republic's welfare, that individual suffering was insignificant compared to collective survival, that enemies faced opponents who preferred death to dishonor. These values, inculcated through constant retelling, created a civic culture that could endure defeats that would have shattered societies, based purely on material interest or personal loyalty. The Republic's survival required not just internal cohesion, but external alliances that could provide security and resources for continued growth. The Foedus Cassianum, negotiated with the Latin League around 493 BC, established the diplomatic framework that would enable expansion throughout Italy. Rather than simply conquering and occupying territory, the city offered defeated enemies a choice: destruction or partnership on terms that preserved local autonomy while requiring military cooperation and loyalty in foreign affairs. This system of graduated citizenship and alliance proved remarkably effective at integrating diverse populations into a confederation dominated by the city on the Seven Hills. Latin cities received rights nearly equivalent to full citizenship. Italian allies obtained protection and trading privileges in exchange for military service. Even former enemies could earn citizenship through loyalty and service, creating powerful incentives for cooperation rather than rebellion. The early republic's greatest institutional innovation was the office of dictator, created to handle emergencies that the normal machinery of government could not address effectively. When external invasion or internal crisis threatened the state's survival, the consuls could appoint a dictator with unlimited authority for a maximum of 6 months. This temporary concentration of power enabled decisive action, while built-in time limits prevented the permanent tyranny that had characterized Tarquin's reign. The first dictatorships dealt primarily with military crises that revealed both the Republic's vulnerabilities and its sources of strength. The Battle of Lake Regillus, fought against a coalition of Latin cities and Tarquin's supporters, demonstrated that the new government could inspire the citizen soldiers to fight with unprecedented determination. Local farmers' warriors, fighting for their own land and liberty, proved superior to professional armies serving foreign rulers or would-be tyrants. Religious innovations reinforced political changes by sacralizing the new constitutional order. The inhabitants believed that their success depended on maintaining proper relationships with the gods through exact performance of traditional rituals. The pontiffs who supervised these ceremonies became guardians of constitutional tradition, as well as religious orthodoxy, since many political procedures had religious dimensions. The oath that citizens swore to the Republic was not just a political commitment, but a sacred vow that invited divine punishment for violations. The expulsion of the monarchs also required practical adjustments in daily governance that revealed the characteristic pragmatism of the people. Functions previously performed by the sovereign were distributed among various officials. Praetors administered justice, censors conducted the citizen census, aediles supervised public works and markets, quaestors managed finances. This multiplication of offices created opportunities for political advancement, while ensuring that no individual could monopolize the expertise necessary for effective administration. The revolution of 509 BC was conservative in the deepest sense. It sought to preserve and strengthen traditional values, rather than create entirely new social arrangements. The revolutionaries claimed to be restoring ancient liberties that Tarquin had violated, rather than establishing unprecedented popular government. This conservative revolutionary rhetoric would echo through subsequent political discourse, as reformers consistently argued that they were defending ancestral custom against dangerous innovations. Yet the republic that emerged from this conservative revolution proved remarkably adaptable to changing circumstances. The institutions created in response to immediate crisis proved flexible enough to govern a city-state, a confederation of Italian communities, and eventually a Mediterranean empire. The values forged in opposition to monarchy, civic virtue, collective responsibility, institutional restraint on personal ambition, provided cultural foundations strong enough to support centuries of expansion and adaptation. As the 5th century began, the city was still a modest settlement, surrounded by enemies and uncertain of its survival. The Etruscan cities to the north remained more wealthy and sophisticated. The Greek colonies to the south possessed superior military technology and cultural achievements. The Gallic tribes beyond the Alps were growing restless and dangerous. Yet the inhabitants had created something unprecedented, a government that drew its strength from citizen participation rather than royal charisma, that promised expansion and integration rather than mere conquest and exploitation, that understood political power as collective responsibility rather than personal privilege. The transformation from monarchy to republic marked more than a change in government. It represented a new conception of human possibility, the idea that ordinary citizens could govern themselves without need for divine rulers or hereditary aristocrats. This revolutionary insight would prove as powerful as the legions in spreading influence throughout the ancient world. The Republic, born from revolution, quickly discovered that overthrowing monarchy was simpler than creating a just society. Within 15 years of Tarquin's expulsion, the very citizens who had sworn eternal opposition to tyranny found themselves divided by conflicts that threatened to tear their young state apart. The enemy was no longer a foreign invader or domestic tyrant, but the fundamental question that haunts every society: who shall rule and by what right? The divide ran deeper than politics or economics. It carved through the heart of civic identity itself. On one side stood the aristocracy, the fathers who claimed descent from the original senators appointed by Romulus himself. These noble families possessed not just wealth and land, but something far more precious: the religious authority to communicate with the gods on behalf of the entire community. Only aristocrats could serve as priests in the most sacred ceremonies. Only they knew the proper rituals that ensured divine favor. Only they possessed the auspices that made governmental decisions legitimate in the eyes of heaven. On the other side gathered the common people, the many, who formed the vast majority of the citizen body, but found themselves excluded from real political influence despite their essential role in the Republic's survival. Common farmers provided the food that fed the city. Ordinary craftsmen created the tools and weapons that equipped the armies. Citizen soldiers formed the backbone of the legions that defended the state against its enemies. Yet when important decisions were made, when magistrates were elected, when laws were passed, aristocratic voices carried overwhelming weight, while popular concerns were dismissed or ignored. The system was not formally tyrannical. No single individual wielded the absolute authority that had made Tarquin so hated. But the collective dominance of the noble class created a different kind of oppression, one that used law and custom rather than force to maintain inequality. Commoners could vote in the popular assemblies, but the voting procedures gave disproportionate influence to the wealthy. They could speak in public meetings, but only magistrates could formally propose legislation, and all magistrates were aristocrats. They could seek justice in the courts, but the laws were unwritten traditions. known only to noble priests who served as judges. Most galling of all was the prohibition on intermarriage between the orders. The aristocracy justified this restriction as necessary to preserve the religious purity that enabled them to serve as intermediaries with the gods. But common citizens saw it as a deliberate attempt to create a hereditary caste system that would perpetuate inequality across generations. Talented families from the masses could accumulate wealth and influence, but they could never truly join the ruling class, never escape the stigma of inferior birth that marked them as unsuitable for the highest honors. The crisis erupted in 494 BC when external military pressure collided with internal social tensions in a way that revealed the Republic's fundamental contradictions. The Volsci and Aequi, mountain tribes threatened by expanding settlements, launched coordinated attacks that required immediate military response. The Senate called up the legions as usual, expecting ordinary citizens to abandon their farms and workshops to fight for a state that denied them equal political rights. The response was unprecedented. The masses refused to serve. This was not mutiny in the traditional sense. No one challenged the authority of elected magistrates or attempted to seize control through violence. Instead, the common people employed a form of resistance that was both more subtle and more devastating. They simply withdrew their cooperation from a system that depended on their participation. Without soldiers from the masses, the legions could not march. Without farmers from the populace, the city could not eat. Without craftsmen from the lower orders, the economy ground to a halt. The withdrawal escalated when popular leaders organized the first secession of the plebs, a mass migration that saw thousands of citizens abandon the city entirely and establish an alternative community on the sacred mount outside the traditional boundaries. This was not rebellion, but something far more threatening to noble authority. The creation of a parallel state that demonstrated popular capacity for self-governance. The secessionists elected their own officials, established their own laws, and organized their own military forces, proving that they needed aristocratic leadership far less than noble leaders needed popular cooperation. Faced with the prospect of ruling over an empty city while hostile armies gathered on the borders, the elite were forced to negotiate. The talks that ended the first secession established precedents that would shape political development for the next 2 centuries. The masses agreed to return to the city and resume their civic obligations, but only in exchange for concrete institutional changes that gave them real political influence rather than merely formal citizenship. The most important concession was the creation of the Tribune of the Plebs, an office that existed specifically to protect popular interests against aristocratic oppression. Tribunes were elected exclusively by common voters, could serve only mass interests, and possessed the sacred authority of veto that enabled them to block any governmental action they deemed harmful to their constituents. Most remarkably, the tribunes' persons were declared sacrosanct. Anyone who harmed them could be killed on the spot without trial, their property confiscated, their family members sold into slavery. This arrangement represented a revolutionary innovation in governmental theory. For the first time in recorded history, a state had created an official position whose primary function was to oppose the government itself. The tribunes were not administrators or military commanders, but professional protesters whose job was to say no to the established authorities whenever those authorities threatened popular interests. The system institutionalized conflict rather than trying to suppress it, recognizing that stable government required not the elimination of opposition, but its channeling through legitimate processes. Yet the tribunate also revealed the fundamental conservatism of popular political thinking. The secessionists had possessed the capacity to destroy the existing state entirely and create something completely new in its place. Instead, they chose to work within traditional structures while demanding modification of those structures to include their interests. They wanted to join the system that had excluded them, not replace it with an alternative system based on different principles. This conservative approach to radical change characterized the entire struggle of the orders. Each popular victory represented not the overthrow of existing institutions, but their expansion to include previously excluded groups. The pattern established during the First Secession would repeat throughout the next 2 centuries. Mass pressure would force elite concessions. New institutions would be created or old ones modified, and the resulting compromises would become part of the constitutional tradition that both sides claimed to be defending. The next major crisis arose from the arbitrary nature of legal proceedings in a system where laws existed only in the memories of noble priests. Common citizens accused of crimes found themselves tried under rules they could not know in advance, judged by standards that seemed to change depending on the social status of the accused. When aristocratic magistrates claimed that revealing the laws would diminish their sacred character and anger the gods, the masses responded that justice required predictable rules, applied equally to all citizens, regardless of birth. The demand for written laws triggered a constitutional crisis that lasted nearly a decade. The nobility resisted codification, not merely from self-interest, but from genuine religious conviction. Many believed that reducing divine law to human writing would destroy its sacred influence and bring disaster upon the community. The deadlock was finally broken through the creation of a special commission, the Decemviri, empowered to suspend normal government and draft a comprehensive legal code. The first board of Decemviri, composed entirely of aristocrats, produced 10 tables of laws that satisfied neither order completely, but represented a genuine attempt at fair codification. However, when their term expired, a second board dominated by the radical noble Appius Claudius Decemvir refused to relinquish control and began ruling as a collective tyranny, more oppressive than any previous monarchy. The crisis reached its climax when Appius Claudius attempted to claim a freeborn common girl, Virginia, as his slave in order to force her into sexual servitude. Virginia's father, faced with the choice between surrendering his daughter to tyranny or watching her suffer public dishonor, killed her with his own hand in the forum, then fled to the army camps to rally opposition to the Decemvirs. The soldiers, horrified by this demonstration of magisterial abuse, elected new tribunes and marched on the city to demand the restoration of constitutional government. Faced with united opposition from both masses and moderate nobles, the Decemvirs resigned and normal institutions were restored. The 12 tables that emerged from this crisis became the foundation of legal development for the next millennium. While the laws themselves were often harsh, debtors could be enslaved, thieves could be killed, and various offenses carried the death penalty. Their publication meant that citizens finally knew what rules governed their society. Equal knowledge of the law, even harsh law, represented a form of equality that had not existed when legal interpretation remained the exclusive privilege of the noble priesthood. More importantly, the 12 tables established the principle that law was a human creation subject to human modification, rather than a divine mystery beyond mortal comprehension. This seemingly technical change had profound implications for political development, since it opened the possibility that laws could be changed through political action rather than religious revelation. If humans had written the laws, humans could rewrite them to address new circumstances or correct old injustices. The struggle for legal equality encouraged popular demands for social recognition that culminated in the campaign for intermarriage rights. The Lex Canuleia of 445 BC abolished the prohibition on marriage between aristocrats and commoners, removing the most visible symbol of hereditary caste distinction. Elite opposition to this reform was fierce, since it threatened to dilute the religious purity that justified their monopoly on sacred offices. But mass pressure, backed by the threat of renewed secession, forced acceptance of a change that fundamentally altered the nature of social hierarchy. With legal marriage came the possibility of genuine social mobility across generational lines. Wealthy families from the masses could now intermarry with noble houses, creating kinship networks that transcended the old caste boundaries. Children of mixed marriages inherited both aristocratic religious status and popular political connections, forming a new class of citizens whose interests bridged the traditional divide between the orders. The success of the intermarriage campaign encouraged popular ambitions for political equality that focused on access to the highest magistracies. The consulship remained exclusively noble throughout the 5th century, despite arguments from the masses that their military service and economic contributions entitled them to share in executive authority. The aristocracy maintained that consuls required religious qualifications that only hereditary priests possessed, but common citizens increasingly viewed this restriction as a transparent attempt to preserve political monopoly through religious mystification. The deadlock over consular access led to another institutional innovation: the creation of military tribunes with consular authority who could be elected from either order. This compromise satisfied neither side completely. Nobles resented sharing executive control, while the masses objected to receiving a substitute office rather than access to the traditional magistracy. But the military tribunate provided valuable experience in high-level administration for popular politicians, while maintaining aristocratic religious prerogatives in purely civilian contexts. The 4th century brought intensified pressure for complete political equality as popular wealth and military importance continued to grow. The Gallic sack of 390 BC demonstrated that external threats required unity between the orders, since successful defense depended on citizen soldiers fighting under commanders from the masses as well as noble officers. The disaster also created opportunities for popular advancement, as traditional institutions proved inadequate for managing the crisis, and capable individuals regardless of birth were pressed into service. The decisive breakthrough came with the Lex Licinia Sextia of 367 BC, which established that one consul must be chosen from the masses in every year going forward. This law represented the culmination of 2 centuries of struggle, since it recognized popular fitness for the highest executive office without qualification or restriction. The nobility could no longer claim that birth alone determined capacity for leadership, since consuls from the masses would possess identical responsibilities and authority as their aristocratic colleagues. The integration of common citizens into the consulship created momentum for broader political inclusion that continued throughout the 4th and 3rd centuries. The praetorship, originally a noble office responsible for legal administration, was open to popular candidates. The censorship, which controlled the citizen census and public morality, became accessible to both orders. Even some priesthoods, traditionally the most exclusive aristocratic preserve, began accepting members from the masses as religious arguments for exclusion lost their persuasive force. The final chapter of the struggle of the orders came with the Lex Hortensia of 287 BC, which resolved the long-standing constitutional question of popular sovereignty. Throughout the Republican period, there had been uncertainty about whether laws passed by the popular assemblies, plebiscita, bound the entire citizen body or only those who voted for them. The aristocracy had argued that their religious authority exempted them from purely popular legislation, while the masses insisted that majority decisions should govern the entire community. The Lex Hortensia settled this dispute definitively by declaring that plebiscita had the force of law for all citizens, regardless of their personal views or social status. This seemingly technical ruling represented a fundamental shift in constitutional theory, since it established the principle that popular will, properly expressed through legitimate institutions, took precedence over traditional privilege and religious authority. By the end of the 3rd century, the struggle of the orders had transformed the Republic from an aristocratic oligarchy into something approaching a genuine democracy. Common citizens could hold any office, marry into any family, and participate equally in all governmental processes. The old caste system had not disappeared entirely. Noble families retained certain ceremonial privileges and social prestige, but it no longer determined access to political influence or economic opportunity. More importantly, the struggle had created institutional mechanisms for managing social conflict that would prove essential for governing an expanding empire. The tribunate provided a safety valve for popular discontent. The written laws ensured predictable justice, and the integration of mass leadership created broader consensus for state policies. The republic that emerged from 2 centuries of internal conflict was stronger, more flexible, and more legitimate than the aristocratic oligarchy that had replaced the monarchy. Yet this very success contained the seeds of future problems. The institutional compromises that had resolved the struggle of the orders assumed a relatively simple society of farmers and craftsmen, whose interests could be balanced through constitutional mechanisms. As territorial expansion brought vast wealth and exotic influences to the city, new forms of inequality would emerge that could not be addressed through the traditional methods that had served so well in simpler times. The infant state faced a world that showed no mercy to the weak. Beyond the 7 hills lay a peninsula divided among dozens of peoples, each jealously guarding their lands, their traditions, and their independence. To the north, the sophisticated Etruscan settlements commanded trade routes and possessed military technologies that made their armies formidable opponents. To the east and south, fierce mountain tribes, the Volsci, Aequi, and Sabines, raided the lowlands whenever opportunity presented itself. Farther south still, Greek colonies boasted wealth and culture that made the Latin communities seem provincial by comparison. Yet this apparent disadvantage would prove to be the new government's greatest strength. Surrounded by potential adversaries, forced to fight for survival from its very birth, the emerging power developed military institutions and diplomatic strategies that would eventually enable it to dominate the entire peninsula. The process would take nearly 2.5 centuries of almost constant conflict, but each victory would add to the Confederation's resources and reputation, while demonstrating to other peoples the advantages of cooperation over resistance. The first test came immediately. The exiled Tarquin, determined to reclaim his throne, convinced the Etruscan lord Lars Porsena to besiege the settlement and restore the monarchy. For the young state, this represented an existential crisis that would determine whether the revolution of 509 could survive its first serious challenge. The siege that followed produced the legendary heroes whose stories would inspire citizens for generations. Horatius Cocles defending the bridge, Mucius Scaevola burning his hand to demonstrate resolve, Cloelia leading the hostages to freedom. But the siege also revealed something more practical: the new government's capacity to endure suffering without surrendering its principles. The citizens accepted starvation rather than submit to royal authority, proving that the reformed institutions commanded loyalties that mere fear could not explain. When Lars Porsena finally withdrew, whether from admiration for their courage or frustration with their stubbornness, the constitutional system had demonstrated that it possessed the internal cohesion necessary for long-term survival. The next challenge came from the Latin communities, traditional partners who viewed the internal changes with suspicion and alarm. The Battle of Lake Regillus, fought around 496 BC, marked the first time that the new government faced a coalition of opponents who understood their military capabilities and political vulnerabilities. The conflict tested not just the reformed armies, but the fundamental claim that citizens would fight more effectively than subjects for a state they had helped create. The victory at Lake Regillus proved that Republican soldiers could indeed defeat traditional forces, but it also demonstrated the limitations of purely military solutions to political problems. The defeated Latin settlements retained their wealth, their populations, and their potential for future resistance. Crushing them completely would have required resources the state did not possess and would have created bitter enemies on its immediate borders. Instead, the leadership chose a different approach that would become characteristic of their growth throughout the peninsula. The Foedus Cassianum, negotiated in the aftermath of the Lake Regillus campaign, established the template for territorial growth through partnership rather than subjugation. Rather than annexing the defeated communities or imposing tribute, the Confederation offered them cooperation on terms that preserved local autonomy while requiring military support. The Latin settlements retained their own governments, laws, and customs, but agreed to provide soldiers for joint campaigns and accept central leadership in foreign affairs. This arrangement proved remarkably effective at transforming former adversaries into reliable supporters. Partner communities gained access to the Confederation's protection and trading networks while maintaining their traditional institutions. The central authority gained additional military resources and strategic depth without the administrative burden of governing unwilling subjects. Most importantly, the system created incentives for loyalty rather than rebellion, since cooperating settlements prospered through partnership and suffered through resistance. The early decades of the 5th century brought constant skirmishing with the mountain peoples who viewed the growing Latin Confederation as a threat to their traditional way of life. The Volsci and Equi launched repeated raids that tested the state's ability to protect its lands and partners. These conflicts were not the decisive campaigns that would characterize later growth, but grinding struggles of attrition that required constant vigilance and gradual gains. The most significant of these early campaigns was the decade-long siege of Veii, an Etruscan settlement whose wealth and strategic position made it a crucial target for northward growth. The siege, conducted between 406 and 396 BC, marked the first time the Confederation had attempted to capture a major fortified position through systematic investment rather than assault. The effort required innovations in logistics, engineering, and military organization that would prove essential for future conquests. More importantly, the siege of Veii established precedents for incorporation that would shape the Confederation's approach to growth for centuries. When the settlement finally fell, its lands were distributed among citizens rather than being governed as a subject province. New communities were established on conquered soil, extending the population base while creating stakeholders with personal interests in defending their acquisitions. Yet just as success seemed to promise continued growth, disaster struck from an unexpected direction. In 390 BC, a Gallic army under the chieftain Brennus descended from the northern mountains and inflicted upon the Confederation the most devastating defeat in its history. The Battle of the Alaya resulted in the complete destruction of the citizen army and the sack of the settlement itself, forcing the survivors to take refuge on the Capitoline Hill, while barbarian warriors plundered their homes and temples. The trauma of the Gallic sack would influence military and political thinking for generations. The citizens had learned that their growing strength could attract dangerous enemies from beyond the traditional sphere of conflict, that success brought new vulnerabilities as well as new opportunities. The humiliation of paying ransom to barbarian invaders, accompanied by Brennus's contemptuous vae victis, woe to the conquered, created a determination never again to appear weak before foreign opponents. Recovery from the Gallic disaster required not just rebuilding physical damage, but reconstructing the military and political institutions that had proven inadequate for the new challenges the Confederation faced. The army was reorganized with better equipment and training. New fortifications were constructed around the enlarged settlement, and the partnership system was strengthened to provide additional security against future invasions. The 4th century brought a series of conflicts that would test these reforms, while gradually extending control throughout central portions of the peninsula. The Samnite peoples, who dominated the mountainous interior, possessed military traditions and ambitions that made conflict with the growing confederation almost inevitable. The 3 Samnite struggles, stretching from 343 to 290 BC, represented the most serious military challenge the state had yet faced. The Samnites were not barbarian raiders, but organized societies with sophisticated military institutions and partnership networks of their own. Their warriors were individually skilled, their leaders strategically competent, and their lands defensible through natural barriers that made conquest difficult and expensive. More dangerously, they understood that the Confederation's growth threatened not just their independence, but their entire way of life. The first Samnite conflict began as a limited intervention on behalf of threatened partners, but escalated into a general struggle for control over the fertile valleys of Campania. The fighting revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the reformed military system. Citizen soldiers motivated by patriotism and personal stake in victory, but commanded by annually elected magistrates whose political concerns sometimes interfered with strategic planning. The second Samnite conflict, the longest and most difficult of the 3, nearly ended in disaster when an entire army was trapped at the Caudine Forks and forced to surrender under humiliating circumstances. The defeated soldiers were compelled to pass under a yoke of spears, while their opponents mocked their pretensions to military superiority. This humiliation, reminiscent of the Gallic sack, strengthened resolve to continue fighting rather than accept a negotiated settlement that would leave enemies in position to repeat such insults. The final phase of Samnite resistance coincided with the Confederation's first direct confrontation with Greek military technology and professional generalship. Pyrrhus of Epirus, invited by the Greek settlement of Tarentum to defend against encroachment, brought to the peninsula elephants, disciplined phalanxes, and tactical innovations that had proven successful against Macedonian and other Hellenistic armies. The Pyrrhic campaigns demonstrated both the Confederation's military limitations and its ultimate source of strength. Pyrrhus won every major engagement, defeating citizen armies with professional skill and superior equipment. His victories at Heraclea and Asculum inflicted casualties that would have ended most ancient conflicts. Yet the state's capacity to absorb losses and continue fighting eventually exhausted even this brilliant commander's resources. The key to survival lay not in military genius, but in strategic endurance backed by the loyalty of partner communities throughout the peninsula. While Pyrrhus could win individual engagements, he could not break the cooperation system that provided the Confederation with continuous reinforcements and economic support. Local populations, given the choice between Greek liberation and continued partnership with their Latin protectors, generally chose the familiar relationship over uncertain independence under foreign leadership. Pyrrhus's famous observation, "Another such victory, and I am undone," captured the essential dynamic of the conflict. Professional armies, however skillful, possessed limited resources that could be depleted through prolonged campaigning. Citizen militias, supported by Confederate contingents and motivated by personal stakes in the outcome, could sustain losses that would destroy mercenary forces while learning from defeats to improve their effectiveness over time. The departure of Pyrrhus in 275 BC marked the effective end of serious resistance to growth throughout the peninsula. The remaining Greek settlements, deprived of external support and facing the reality of the Confederation's demonstrated staying power, negotiated surrenders that preserved their local autonomy while acknowledging supremacy in foreign affairs. The Samnites, exhausted by decades of conflict and isolated by the defection of former partners, accepted settlements that left them nominally independent but practically subordinate. By 265 BC, the central state controlled or dominated lands stretching from the Valley of the Po in the north to the Straits of Messina in the south. This growth had been achieved not through a single brilliant campaign, but through 2.5 centuries of persistent effort that combined military pressure with diplomatic flexibility. Former enemies had become partners, conquered regions had been integrated through settlement and citizenship grants, and local traditions had been preserved within an overarching framework of unity. The success of this growth rested on institutional innovations that distinguished the Confederation's approach from that of previous conquerors. Rather than extracting tribute from subject peoples, the system offered partnerships that provided mutual benefits. Rather than imposing uniform government on diverse populations, it preserved local autonomy while requiring only loyalty in foreign affairs and military service for common defense. Most importantly, the state had developed a form of citizenship that could accommodate various levels of participation and loyalty. Full citizens enjoyed complete political rights and could hold office in the central government. Latin partners possessed most civic privileges and could earn full citizenship through service or migration. Italian Confederates retained local self-government while contributing to military campaigns under central leadership. This flexible approach to political identity enabled the absorption of vast numbers of new citizens without diluting the bonds of loyalty that held the system together. Each incorporated community gained stakeholders in the Confederation's continued success while contributing resources for further growth. The result was not an empire imposed upon unwilling subjects, but a federation of communities, with shared interests in maintaining their collective security and prosperity. Yet the very success of this system created new challenges that would test the state's institutions in ways their creators had never anticipated. The wealth and responsibilities that came with controlling the peninsula attracted enemies whose resources and ambitions dwarfed those of any previous opponents. Across the Mediterranean, other powers were watching this rise with mixtures of admiration, concern, and calculation about how this new force might affect their own interests and security. The transformation from a besieged settlement to the dominant force on the peninsula had taken less than 3 centuries, but it had fundamentally altered both the government's character and its position in the wider world. The institutions created for governing a single community now controlled regions inhabited by millions of people, speaking dozens of languages and following various traditions. The citizen soldiers who had once fought to defend their farms now campaigned hundreds of miles from home, in pursuit of objectives that transcended local concerns. Most significantly, success had created expectations and ambitions that could not be satisfied through defensive policies or limited objectives. The leadership had learned that security required strength, that strength enabled growth, and that growth brought both opportunities and obligations that demanded ever greater resources and more distant commitments. The logic of this progression would soon carry them beyond the peninsula entirely, into conflicts whose scale and consequences would transform not just the Confederation, but the entire ancient world. Across the narrow straits that separated Sicily from the mainland lay a world that would transform the modest Latin state into something unprecedented in human history, a Mediterranean superpower. The collision between the growing peninsular power and the ancient maritime empire of Carthage would span more than a century, consume countless lives, and determine whether the future belonged to a Semitic trading empire or a constitutional republic. When the smoke finally cleared, one civilization would lie in ruins, while the other would stride across 3 continents as master of the known world. The North African metropolis in 264 BC was everything the Latin Alliance was not. Founded by Phoenician colonists centuries earlier, this commercial hub commanded trade routes that stretched from Spain to the Levant. Its harbours sheltered merchant vessels that carried silver from Iberian mines, ivory from African forests, and luxury goods from across the Mediterranean. Its people were cosmopolitan traders who spoke multiple languages and understood markets from Gades to Alexandria. Most importantly, its wealth enabled it to hire professional armies that had conquered territories throughout the Western Mediterranean without requiring its own populace to fight. The contrast with the peninsular system could hardly have been more complete. Where the African empire relied on mercenaries motivated by pay, the Latin state fielded soldiers fighting for their homeland. Where the Phoenician power extracted wealth from subject territories, the constitutional government offered partnership and eventual civic rights. Where North African politics centered on commercial interests and factional rivalries, the republican system emphasized civic duty and collective decision-making. These fundamental differences in political culture and military organization would shape every aspect of the coming struggles. Neither side initially understood how profound these differences were, or how they would determine the ultimate outcome of conflicts that began over a minor dispute in a Sicilian border town. The immediate cause of the First Punic struggle was almost absurdly trivial. The Mamertines, mercenaries who had seized control of Messana in Sicily, found themselves trapped between expanding Syracusan power and African intervention. Facing destruction, they appealed simultaneously to both the Maritime Empire and the Latin Alliance for protection. The Africans arrived first and installed a garrison, but the Mamertines then changed their minds and requested peninsular assistance to expel their new protectors. The Senate initially hesitated to become involved in Sicilian affairs, recognizing that intervention would mean confrontation with the most powerful state in the Western Mediterranean. But the popular assemblies, influenced by ambitious magistrates who saw opportunities for glory and plunder, voted to send assistance. When the expedition crossed the straits in 264 BC, it marked the first military action outside the home peninsula and the beginning of transformation into a Mediterranean power. The early campaigns revealed how ill-prepared the Latin forces were for this new form of hostility. Sicily was not the familiar peninsula, where soldiers could fight near their homes and return to their farms during planting and harvest seasons. The island required permanent garrisons, complex logistics, and above all, naval capabilities that the constitutional state simply did not possess. For the first time in their history, the peninsular armies found themselves fighting opponents who could not be reached by their traditional methods. African naval supremacy made every Latin soldier in Sicily a potential prisoner, every supply convoy a target for interception. The Phoenician armada could land armies wherever it chose, evacuate threatened garrisons, and cut off opposing forces from reinforcement or retreat. The Republican leadership quickly realized that this confrontation could not be won through the land-based strategies that had succeeded throughout the home territory. The decision to build a maritime force represented one of the most audacious gambles in ancient history. The Latin peoples possessed virtually no naval traditions, no experienced shipwrights, no trained crews capable of maneuvering vessels in combat. When they captured an African warship and used it as a model for mass production, they demonstrated both their practical ingenuity and their complete ignorance of maritime combat. The first armada they launched was so poorly constructed that many ships sank in calm weather. Yet the Republican system's fundamental strengths, the willingness of the populace to sacrifice for collective goals, and the ability to learn from disasters, gradually overcame these initial disadvantages. Peninsular engineers developed the Corvus, a boarding bridge that enabled their troops to fight sea battles as if they were land engagements. Volunteer crews learned seamanship through trial and error, developing skills that professional African sailors had inherited through generations of experience. The transformation was neither quick nor painless. Entire armadas were lost to storms, incompetent navigation, and enemy action. The disaster at Drepana in 249 BC saw 93 vessels captured and thousands of experienced mariners killed or enslaved. The loss of another squadron off Camarina the following year nearly forced the Republic to abandon its maritime ambitions entirely. Yet each defeat taught lessons that improved subsequent performance. While the citizen-based recruitment system could replace losses that would have crippled a professional navy, Marcus Attilius Regulus became the symbol of both Republican courage and inexperience during this first great overseas struggle. After winning a spectacular maritime victory at Ecnomus, he landed in Africa with the intention of forcing the enemy capital to surrender by threatening its homeland. The plan was strategically sound, but tactically naive. Regulus underestimated both defensive capabilities and his own army's vulnerability in unfamiliar terrain. The defeat that followed was catastrophic. The African army, reinforced by Greek military advisors and fighting on familiar ground, destroyed the expeditionary force and captured Regulus himself. According to later accounts, his captors eventually sent him back to negotiate a prisoner exchange, but he urged the Senate to reject their terms and returned voluntarily to torture and death. Whether this story was historically accurate mattered less than its function in defining the values that enabled the Republic to endure unprecedented losses without surrendering. The turning point came at the Battle of the Aegates Islands in 241 BC, where a rebuilt Latin armada finally achieved decisive maritime victory. The Africans, exhausted by 23 years of struggle and facing rebellion among their unpaid mercenaries, agreed to evacuate Sicily and pay a massive indemnity. For the first time in its history, the constitutional state controlled territory outside the home peninsula, marking its transformation from a regional power into a Mediterranean empire. Yet victory brought new challenges that tested Republican institutions in unexpected ways. Sicily could not be integrated through the traditional methods that had worked throughout the peninsula. The island's Greek and Phoenician inhabitants possessed different languages, laws, and traditions, that could not easily be reconciled with Latin practices. More problematically, the wealth generated by overseas territories created new sources of inequality and corruption that threatened the civic values on which the constitutional system depended. The solution was to govern Sicily as the first province, administered by Latin magistrates, but not incorporated into the body politic. This arrangement preserved the constitutional system from disruption while enabling the extraction of resources necessary to fund future struggles. But it also established precedents for imperial governance that would eventually transform the character of the state itself. The Second Punic hostilities erupted from African efforts to compensate for their Sicilian losses through expansion in Iberia. Under the leadership of the Barcid family, first Hamilcar, then his son-in-law Hasdrubal, and finally his son Hannibal, the maritime empire built a new dominion based on Spanish silver mines and indigenous military recruits. This expansion brought them into contact with Saguntum, a Spanish town that had allied itself with the Latin state. When Hannibal besieged Saguntum in 219 BC, he created the pretext for a confrontation that both sides recognized as inevitable. The first struggle had determined control over Sicily. The second would decide which civilization would dominate the Western Mediterranean. Unlike the previous generation, both sides understood the stakes and prepared for a fight to the finish. Hannibal's invasion plan was brilliant in its conception and execution. Rather than challenge Latin naval supremacy directly, he would march overland through Gaul and across the Alps, bringing the fighting to the home peninsula itself. There, he would exploit the Republic's reliance on citizen soldiers by making it impossible for them to return to their farms, while simultaneously encouraging allied communities to revolt by demonstrating that their protectors could not protect themselves. The crossing of the Alps in winter, 218 BC, remains one of the greatest military achievements in ancient history. Hannibal's polyglot army, Africans, Spaniards, Gauls, and others, united only by loyalty to their commander, traversed terrain that had never been attempted by a major military force. The journey cost him nearly half his troops and most of his elephants, but it achieved complete strategic surprise and brought him into northern territories with his core forces intact. The psychological impact of the invasion was enormous. For the first time since the Gallic sack 3 centuries earlier, foreign armies were ravaging peninsular soil, while the Republican forces seemed powerless to stop them. The defeats at Trebia and Lake Trasimene demonstrated that traditional tactics were useless against Hannibal's innovative battlefield techniques and superior cavalry forces. The disaster at Cannae in 216 BC brought the constitutional state closer to collapse than at any time since its founding. Hannibal's tactical masterpiece resulted in the complete destruction of the largest Latin army ever assembled, with casualties that included dozens of senators and hundreds of knights. The surviving consul, Gaius Terentius Varro, returned to the capital expecting execution for his failure, but was instead thanked by the Senate for not despairing of the state. This response revealed the psychological resilience that would ultimately prove more decisive than any tactical innovation. While other ancient societies might have sought terms after such catastrophic losses, the republican system generated levels of commitment that professional armies could not break. The Senate refused even to discuss negotiations, while foreign forces remained on home soil, declaring that victory or destruction were the only acceptable outcomes. The strategy that emerged from these disasters bore the name of Quintus Fabius Maximus, whose refusal to engage Hannibal in direct combat earned him the contemptuous nickname Cunctator, the Delayer. Fabian tactics emphasized attrition over confrontation, using superior resources and manpower to gradually exhaust enemy forces, while avoiding the pitched battles where Hannibal's tactical genius could achieve decisive results. This approach required extraordinary patience and political courage. The populace who had volunteered to fight watched their farms burn, while their armies shadowed the enemy without engaging. Allied communities faced African reprisals, while their protectors seemed to abandon them to their fate. Opposition politicians accused Fabius of cowardice and demanded aggressive action that would restore military prestige through spectacular victories. Yet the strategy worked precisely because it exploited the fundamental weaknesses of Hannibal's position. Cut off from reinforcement by Latin naval control, dependent on local forage for supplies, commanding troops whose loyalty was personal rather than patriotic, the enemy general faced problems that tactical brilliance could not solve. Each year that passed without decisive victory weakened his forces while strengthening Republican resolve. The counteroffensive that eventually ended the struggle began not in the home peninsula, but in Iberia, where Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Africanus, developed the tactics and trained the troops that would ultimately defeat Hannibal. Scipio understood that the enemy system's reliance on mercenary armies and allied communities created vulnerabilities that could be exploited through political as well as military means. The capture of New Carthage in 209 BC demonstrated Scipio's innovative approach. Rather than simply looting the settlement and enslaving its population, he released Spanish hostages and recruited local tribes through generous treatment and respect for their traditions. This policy gradually detached African allies and created new sources of manpower for the Latin armies. Meanwhile, superior resources enabled the maintenance of multiple armies simultaneously, something the enemy could not match. While Fabius contained Hannibal in the southern peninsula, other forces operated in Sicily, Sardinia, and Iberia. When Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal, finally crossed the Alps with reinforcements, he was intercepted and destroyed at the Metaurus River before he could link up with the main enemy army. The final phase moved to Africa, where Scipio implemented the same strategy that had succeeded in Iberia. By demonstrating that Phoenician power could not protect its allies, he encouraged defections that isolated the enemy capital. When Hannibal was recalled from the peninsula to defend his homeland, the psychological effect was as important as the military consequences. The invincible general was abandoning his conquests because he could not hold them. The Battle of Zama in 202 BC marked the end of African dreams of Mediterranean dominance. Scipio's tactical innovations, combined with Numidian cavalry that had transferred their allegiance from the maritime empire to the constitutional state, resulted in Hannibal's first and final defeat. The peace terms that followed reduced the North African power to a client state, stripping away its overseas territories and limiting its military forces to levels that could threaten no one. Yet even this decisive victory could not satisfy the hatred that 16 years of existential struggle had generated among the Latin population. The memory of Cannae, of burning farms and slaughtered compatriots, created a determination that the enemy capital must be destroyed entirely rather than merely defeated. The Third Punic Struggle, launched in 149 BC on transparently fabricated pretexts, represented not strategic necessity, but the working out of collective trauma through genocidal violence. The siege lasted 3 years and required the development of new techniques for attacking heavily fortified settlements. When the defenses were finally breached in 146 BC, the systematic destruction that followed erased one of the Mediterranean's greatest metropolises from existence. The population was killed or enslaved, the buildings were demolished, and salt was allegedly sown in the soil to ensure that nothing would ever grow there again. The concurrent destruction of Corinth in the same year marked the completion of transformation into a Mediterranean empire. Both settlements had been centers of civilization that preserved cultural and intellectual traditions stretching back centuries. Their elimination demonstrated that the Latin state now possessed both the power and the will to reshape the ancient world according to its own interests and values. The Punic struggles had begun as a dispute over a minor Sicilian town and evolved into a civilizational confrontation that determined the future of the Mediterranean world. The republic that emerged victorious was fundamentally different from the modest peninsular alliance that had first crossed the straits to Sicily. It controlled territories from Spain to Asia Minor, commanded armadas that dominated every sea, and possessed resources that dwarfed those of any remaining rival. Yet victory had come at an enormous cost that extended far beyond the casualties and financial expenses of over a century of nearly continuous hostilities. The soldier farmers who had won these struggles returned home to find their farms ruined and their traditional way of life threatened by economic changes they could not control. The constitutional system that had enabled victory was straining under the pressures of governing an empire whose scale and complexity exceeded anything its founders had imagined. Most ominously, the very success of territorial expansion created new forms of inequality and ambition that could not be contained within the traditional political framework. The wealth that flowed from conquered territories enriched some enormously, while leaving others worse off than before. The military commands necessary for imperial governance concentrated unprecedented authority in the hands of individual generals whose loyalty to constitutional norms could no longer be taken for granted. The destruction of the great African metropolis marked not just the end of a rival empire, but the beginning of internal struggles that would ultimately prove more dangerous to the Republic than any foreign enemy had ever been. The smoke had barely cleared from the ruins of Carthage when the victorious state discovered that triumph could be more dangerous than defeat. The destruction of its greatest rival left the Mediterranean world without effective opposition to Latin dominance. But it also removed the external pressures that had forced internal unity and civic discipline. For the first time in centuries, ambitious individuals could pursue personal advancement without fear that factional conflicts might invite foreign intervention. The result was a transformation of governmental culture that would prove more destructive than any enemy army. The riches that poured into the capital from conquered territories were unprecedented in scale and corrupting in effect. Spanish silver mines, Egyptian grain shipments, and Asian tribute created fortunes that dwarfed anything previously seen in the peninsula. Traditional virtues, frugality, simplicity, devotion to agricultural labor, seemed quaint and obsolete when provincial governorships could yield more gold in a single year than honest farming produced in a lifetime. The physical city itself reflected these changes. Where once the capital had been a modest collection of hills dotted with simple temples and practical buildings, now marble monuments imported from Greek quarries competed for attention with elaborate private mansions that showcased exotic treasures from across the known world. The Forum, traditionally a marketplace where the populace gathered to conduct business and debate policy, became a showpiece where affluent families displayed their success through ever more ostentatious architectural projects. More fundamentally, the very nature of civic participation began to change. The farmer soldiers who had defeated Hannibal and conquered the Mediterranean had been motivated by personal stakes in their community's survival and prosperity. They fought because defeat meant the loss of their homes, their families, and their way of life. They served in government because participation was both a privilege and a responsibility of free men who shared in their society's benefits and burdens. But the vast territories created new categories of people whose relationship to the state was purely extractive. Provincial governors and their staffs viewed their appointments as opportunities for personal enrichment rather than public service. Tax collectors, publicani, bid for the right to squeeze resources from subject territories, keeping whatever they could collect above their contracted payments to the treasury. Military commanders prolonged campaigns and provoked unnecessary conflicts to maximize their opportunities for plunder and slave-taking. The consequences were felt first and most severely in the countryside, where small farmers found themselves unable to compete with vast slave-worked estates, latifundia, that produced grain more cheaply than free labor could manage. Soldiers returning from years of overseas service discovered their farms in ruins, their families scattered, and their traditional livelihood no longer economically viable. The choice was stark: sell out to affluent investors and migrate to the city, or struggle against economic forces that made independent farming increasingly impossible. The urban population swelled with displaced farmers who possessed few skills relevant to city life and no capital to establish themselves in trade or craft production. These rural refugees formed a new social class, the urban poor, whose desperation made them available for manipulation by ambitious individuals willing to promise them relief. The traditional bonds between patron and client, which had once provided security and stability throughout society, became purely transactional relationships based on immediate material benefits, rather than long-term mutual obligations. The Senate, which had provided steady leadership during the centuries of expansion, proved incapable of addressing these new challenges. Its members, drawn from families enriched by overseas opportunities, had personal interests in maintaining the system that had made them prosperous. Their perspective was necessarily conservative. They sought to preserve arrangements that benefited them, while viewing popular demands for change as dangerous threats to legitimate authority and social order. Into this volatile situation stepped Tiberius Sempronius Gracchus, whose family background gave him impeccable credentials within the traditional elite, but whose experiences had convinced him that radical changes were necessary to preserve the state's fundamental character. As a young officer, he had witnessed the devastation of the Italian countryside and understood that the displacement of small farmers threatened the military recruitment system on which defense depended. As a member of the aristocratic class, he recognized that growing inequality was creating social tensions that could explode into open-class warfare. Tiberius's solution was elegantly simple: redistribute public land that had been illegally occupied by prosperous investors to landless people who would farm it as independent proprietors. The proposal was neither radical nor unprecedented. Similar land distributions had been conducted throughout the constitutional period without controversy. What made Tiberius's version threatening was its scale and the methods he employed to implement it against aristocratic opposition. When the Senate blocked his legislation through traditional procedural mechanisms, Tiberius appealed directly to the popular assemblies, arguing that the will of the people should take precedence over elite preferences. When his fellow tribune, Marcus Octavius, vetoed the land bill, Tiberius persuaded the assembly to depose Octavius from office, an action that was probably legal but violated centuries of constitutional tradition. When the aristocrats refused to fund the Land Redistribution Commission, Tiberius proposed using treasure captured from the Kingdom of Pergamon to finance the program. Each of these actions represented a constitutional innovation that strengthened popular authority at the expense of traditional elite privileges. Taken together, They suggested a systematic attempt to transform the state's balance in ways that threatened the foundations of aristocratic influence. The response was swift and violent. When Tiberius sought re-election to continue his program, a mob of aristocrats and their supporters clubbed him to death in the Forum, along with 300 of his followers. The assassination of Tiberius Gracchus marked the beginning of violence as a normal feature of governmental life. Previous conflicts had been resolved through negotiation and compromise, even when fundamental interests were at stake. The murder of a sitting magistrate for proposing legal changes established the precedent that disputes could be settled through force when traditional methods failed to produce desired results. 10 years later, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius, renewed the program with modifications designed to address the weaknesses that had destroyed his predecessor. Where Tiberius had focused narrowly on land redistribution, Gaius constructed a broader coalition by offering benefits to multiple social groups. The urban poor received subsidized grain distributions that guaranteed them basic food security. The equestrian class, prosperous non-aristocrats, gained the right to serve on extortion courts that tried provincial governors, giving them leverage over the aristocratic governors whose corruption had previously been immune from prosecution. Gaius also demonstrated a more sophisticated understanding of mass communication, using rhetorical skills and theatrical gestures to build popular support for his programs. He dressed in simple clothing to emphasize his identification with ordinary people, spoke with passionate emotion about the injustices that motivated his initiatives, and created visual spectacles that made abstract policy proposals concrete and compelling for mass audiences. For 2 years, this strategy succeeded brilliantly. Gaius dominated the process, enacted substantial changes, and built a coalition that seemed capable of sustaining long-term transformation. But his very success generated opposition that ultimately proved more determined and better organized than his supporters. When his momentum began to fade, the aristocratic establishment moved decisively to eliminate him and his movement permanently. The final confrontation came in 121 BC, when the consul Lucius Opimius received the Senate's first Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a decree authorizing him to use any means necessary to preserve the state. This emergency authorization, which would become a standard weapon against popular leaders, essentially declared martial law and suspended normal legal protections. The battle that followed on the Aventine Hill resulted in the deaths of Gaius Gracchus and 3,000 of his supporters, ending the first systematic attempt at popular change. Yet the Gratian movement had permanent effects that shaped all subsequent development. It demonstrated that traditional institutions could not address the social and economic problems created by territorial expansion without fundamental modifications. It showed that popular assemblies could be mobilized to override aristocratic authority when skilled individuals appealed directly to mass interests. Most importantly, it established the precedent that disputes could escalate to violence when constitutional mechanisms failed to produce resolution. The decades following the Gratian crisis saw the emergence of new forms of organization that reflected the vast territory's growing complexity and the breakdown of traditional civic culture. The Optimates, best men, represented the aristocratic establishment's attempt to preserve their dominance through coordinated action and ideological appeal to ancestral custom. The Populares, popular faction, became the label for individuals who sought advancement through direct appeals to popular assemblies and programs that challenged elite privileges. These factional identities were not formal parties with consistent programs and permanent membership, but rather loose coalitions that formed around specific issues and immediate tactical considerations. Individual leaders might align with either faction depending on their current ambitions and circumstances. What mattered was not ideological consistency, but the practical question of whether a particular person was working within established elite networks or appealing over their heads to popular sentiment. The Jugurthine War provided a spectacular demonstration of how overseas corruption had infected the entire governmental system. Jugurtha, an ambitious Numidian prince, had learned during his service with Latin armies that virtually any official could be bought if the price was right. When he murdered his way to sole control in Numidia, he simply bribed successive commanders and their staffs to overlook his crimes and recognize his legitimacy. The scandal that erupted when these bribes became public knowledge revealed the extent to which provincial commands had become opportunities for personal enrichment rather than public service. Investigations showed that consuls, generals, and entire delegations had accepted payments to betray their responsibilities and abandon allies to a murderous usurper. The popular outrage that followed brought Gaius Marius to prominence as a military commander who promised to fight competently rather than profitably. Meanwhile, the growing number of slave revolts throughout the territories demonstrated the inherent instability of an economic system based on mass exploitation of unwilling labor. The most serious of these uprisings, led by the gladiator Spartacus, saw enslaved workers throughout southern Italy join a rebellion that lasted 2 years and required multiple consular armies to suppress. The revolt's scale and duration revealed both the desperate conditions under which slaves lived and the military potential they possessed when united under competent leadership. The Spartacus rebellion also highlighted the ironic relationship between territorial expansion and domestic security. The same military conquests that enriched elite families and provided slaves for their estates created security threats that required constant vigilance and periodic military intervention. The vast dominion was consuming its own foundations by creating social conditions that generated perpetual internal conflicts. Religious and cultural changes accompanied these economic and administrative transformations, as traditional beliefs and practices came under pressure from contact with sophisticated foreign civilizations. Greek philosophy offered intellectual frameworks that challenged ancestral customs and encouraged critical examination of inherited assumptions. Mystery religions from the East provided spiritual alternatives to traditional civic ceremonies that had lost much of their meaning in the context of governing diverse territories. The very success of Latin arms had created a crisis of cultural identity that paralleled the administrative and economic disruptions of the age. People who had once defined themselves through their participation in a small agricultural community now belonged to a vast dominion that included millions of subjects with different languages, laws, and traditions. The civic virtues that had enabled the conquest of the Mediterranean seemed increasingly irrelevant to the practical challenges of governing diverse populations across 3 continents. Sumptuary laws attempting to regulate luxury consumption demonstrated elite awareness that traditional values were under threat, but they also revealed the futility of legislative solutions to cultural problems. Leaders who gave speeches praising ancestral simplicity while living in marble palaces decorated with Greek art could hardly expect their constituents to embrace frugality as a civic virtue. The intellectual life of the capital reflected these broader cultural tensions. Latin authors began producing literature that wrestled seriously with the moral implications of territorial dominance and the psychological costs of success. Historians like Polybius analyzed the institutional arrangements that had enabled expansion, while questioning whether those same institutions could survive the transformations that expansion had created. Legal development during this period showed similar tensions between traditional forms and realities. The 12 tables that had governed society for centuries proved inadequate for resolving disputes that involved foreign laws. Commercial relationships spanning multiple provinces and conflicts between different legal statuses. The praetors who administered justice were forced to develop new legal principles, ius gentium, that could accommodate the dominion's complexity while maintaining some connection to ancestral precedents. Educational practices also evolved to meet the demands of governing a multicultural dominion. Young aristocrats who expected to hold provincial commands needed to understand Greek literature. Eastern commercial practices and military techniques developed in various cultural contexts. The traditional education, which had emphasized practical skills and moral development within a specifically Latin context, expanded to include subjects that would have seemed foreign and potentially corrupting to earlier generations. By the end of the 2nd century BC, the state had achieved everything its founders could have imagined and more. Latin armies controlled territory from Spain to Asia Minor. Latin law governed millions of subjects who had previously lived under dozens of different legal systems. Latin engineering had created an infrastructure of roads, aqueducts, and public buildings that facilitated communication and commerce throughout the Mediterranean world. Yet these very achievements had created problems that threatened survival more seriously than any external enemy ever had. The institutions designed for governing a city-state proved inadequate for managing vast territories. The civic virtues that had motivated farmer soldiers fighting for their homes became corrupted when those same people could enrich themselves by exploiting distant provinces. The consensual government that had united various Italian peoples around shared interests fractured when overseas resources created new forms of inequality that could not be reconciled through traditional compromises. Most ominously, the military system that had conquered the world was beginning to develop loyalties that transcended constitutional authority. Soldiers who served for years in distant provinces under charismatic commanders developed personal bonds that proved stronger than abstract obligations to the state. The professional armies that defense required created new centers of influence that could challenge civilian government when their interests conflicted with aristocratic policies. The transformation was complete. The state that had destroyed Carthage through civic virtue and institutional discipline was being destroyed in turn by the resources and authority that victory had brought. The next generation would witness the final breakdown of constitutional government as ambitious generals learned to use overseas resources and professional armies to pursue objectives that no amount of traditional authority could resist. The governmental order that had conquered the Mediterranean was cracking under pressures its founders had never imagined. The breakdown came not as a sudden collapse, but as a series of seemingly reasonable adaptations to practical problems, each of which weakened ancient restraints on personal ambition while strengthening the means available to those bold enough to exploit them. By the early 1st century BC, the institutions created to govern a city-state were managing an empire whose scale and complexity required new solutions that would ultimately destroy the very framework they were meant to preserve. The transformation began with a catastrophe that exposed the inadequacy of ancient military recruitment for the demands of global governance. The social war of 91 to 88 BC erupted when Italian allies who had fought loyally for centuries in Latin armies finally demanded the citizenship rights they had long been promised but never received. These communities possessed the martial experience and organizational capacity to pose a serious threat to the heartland itself, forcing a recognition that the civic structure could no longer exclude populations whose cooperation was essential for defense. The conflict revealed fundamental contradictions in the governmental framework. The same territorial growth that had made the state wealthy and influential had also created military obligations that exceeded the capacity of ancient citizen farmers to fulfill. Troops were needed continuously in multiple theaters, suppressing provincial rebellions, defending frontier regions, and conducting the exploratory campaigns that ambitious generals used to enhance their reputations and enrich their followers. Yet the old recruitment methods assumed that military service was a temporary obligation that the populace could fulfill between planting and harvest, while maintaining their primary identity as independent farmers. This assumption had been strained for generations by the increasing length and distance of overseas campaigns, but the social war made its complete breakdown undeniable. The state needed professional troops who could serve for years without returning to civilian occupations that no longer existed for most of the population. Into this emergency stepped Gaius Marius, whose martial genius was matched by his understanding of the social changes that ancient institutions had failed to address. The Marian reforms, implemented during his consulships in the last decade of the 2nd century, transformed military service from a civic obligation of property-owning farmers into a career opportunity for the landless urban masses who had been created by earlier economic disruptions. The changes were seemingly technical, but fundamentally revolutionary. Where previous recruitment had required troops to provide their own equipment, Marius armed his forces at state expense, creating standardized legions equipped with uniform weapons and organized according to professional rather than social criteria. Where ancient service had been limited in duration, Marian troops enlisted for fixed terms that could extend for decades. Most importantly, where earlier armies had been motivated by defense of their own property, the new legions were promised land grants at the end of their service, grants that could only be provided through the influence of their commanding generals. This last innovation proved decisive in transforming the relationship between martial and civilian leadership. Troops who depended on their generals for their retirement security developed personal loyalties that transcended abstract obligations to established government. Generals who controlled the distribution of land grants possessed means for building coalitions that no purely civilian leader could match. The result was the emergence of a new form of leadership that combined martial command with popular appeal in ways that threatened ancient elite control. Marius himself demonstrated both the potential and the dangers of this new arrangement. His victories over Jugurtha in North Africa and the Germanic tribes, Teutones and Cimbri, who threatened the northern frontiers, established his reputation as the most successful general of his generation. His ability to recruit and train effective armies from populations that ancient recruitment had rejected proved that the martial emergency could be solved through institutional innovation. But his repeated consulships, 6 in total, violating the principle that limited individuals to a single term, set precedents for personal rule that subsequent generals would exploit more systematically. The first test of the new martial structure came with the Mithridatic Wars, which began when Mithridates VI of Pontus challenged Latin control over Asia Minor by massacring tens of thousands of Italian merchants and their families throughout the Eastern territories. The scale and coordination of these attacks demonstrated that provincial subjects retained both the capacity and the motivation for armed resistance despite generations of apparently stable governance. The emergency created opportunities for ambitious generals to enhance their reputations through spectacular victories over exotic enemies, but it also revealed how easily established procedures could be manipulated when martial commands carried such enormous potential rewards. The rivalry between Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla over the lucrative Mithridatic command escalated into open conflict when each side used violence to override legal decisions that favored their opponents. Sulla's march on the capital in 88 BC marked the first time that a general had used his army directly against the established government that had appointed him. The precedent was technically justified. Sulla claimed he was defending legitimate governance against illegal popular violence. But the practical effect was to demonstrate that armed force could trump civilian decisions when generals possessed both the means and the motivation to resist unwelcome orders. The civil wars that followed destroyed the last pretense that established forms could contain the ambitions unleashed by territorial growth. Both Marius and Sulla built coalitions that combined personal followers, disaffected social groups, and allied foreign states in pursuit of objectives that transcended ancient factional competition. The stakes were no longer limited to particular policies or offices, but extended to fundamental questions about who would control the state and how that control would be exercised. Sulla's eventual victory in 82 BC brought to office a leader whose understanding of the emergency was both more systematic and more radical than any previous attempt at institutional renovation. Where earlier generals had used extraordinary circumstances to justify temporary violations of established norms, Sulla embraced the title of dictator and embarked on a comprehensive program designed to restore ancient government through means that completely violated ancient principles. The prescription lists that Sulla published represented a new form of violence that went far beyond the targeted assassinations that had characterized earlier factional conflicts. These were systematic attempts to eliminate entire categories of potential opposition through mass executions, property confiscations, and legal disabilities that could extend across generations. The victims included not only active opponents, but also individuals whose wealth, connections, or potential influence made them threats to the new order. The scale of the killing was unprecedented in the civic period. Thousands of individuals were murdered legally, their property distributed to Sulla's supporters, their families reduced to poverty and irrelevance. The psychological impact was equally important. Survivors learned that opposition could carry costs that no rational calculation of self-interest could justify. The result was a temporary peace based on terror rather than consensus. Yet Sulla's reforms demonstrated a genuine understanding of the structural problems that had enabled the emergency. His restrictions on the tribunate addressed the institutional mechanisms that popular leaders had used to circumvent aristocratic control. His requirements for sequential office holding, cursus honorum, were designed to prevent rapid advancement by individuals who lacked ancient qualifications. His expansion of the courts and systematization of legal procedures created alternatives to the popular assemblies that had proven susceptible to demagogic manipulation. Most importantly, Sulla's settlement of his veteran troops in colonies throughout Italy represented an attempt to recreate the social foundations of established government by establishing new communities of property-owning inhabitants whose interests would align with maintaining stable institutions. If successful, this program might have restored the civic culture that territorial growth had destroyed, while providing employment for the professional troops whose loyalty had made his victory possible. The great paradox of Sulla's dictatorship was its voluntary conclusion. Having achieved complete control over the state and eliminated all effective opposition, Sulla retired to private life in 79 BC, apparently confident that his institutional innovations would preserve the ancient framework he had violated to restore. This decision revealed both his genuine commitment to established principles and his fundamental misunderstanding of the forces he had unleashed. The failure of the Sullan settlement became apparent within years of his retirement, as new leaders emerged who understood how to exploit the precedents he had established while avoiding the limitations he had tried to impose. The machinery of legal violence he had created could be operated by anyone who gained control of it. The veteran colonies he had established provided models for subsequent land distributions that served different objectives. Most dangerously, his demonstration that established government could be suspended temporarily encouraged others to believe that it could be suspended permanently. The decade following Sulla's death saw the emergence of generals who combined his institutional innovations with more sophisticated understanding of popular appeal and coalition building. These new strongmen learned to present their ambitions in terms that emphasized continuity with ancient practice, while systematically undermining the foundations of that practice through practical choices. Pompey the Great exemplified this new form of leadership. His martial achievements in suppressing the slave revolt, led by Spartacus, clearing the Mediterranean of pirates, and conquering vast territories in the east, established his reputation as the most successful general since Marius. But his methods demonstrated how completely the established framework had been subordinated to personal ambition. Pompey's extraordinary commands, granted through popular legislation that overrode ancient limitations on individual influence, created precedents for concentrating multiple provinces and martial assets under single generals for extended periods. His triumph celebrations displayed wealth and exotic prisoners that made earlier victory parades seem modest by comparison. His theatre complex and other public works projects established new standards for the architectural glorification of individual achievement. Yet Pompey's very success created the conditions for his eventual downfall by inspiring imitators who possessed equal ambition but superior skills. The informal alliance known as the First Triumvirate brought together Pompey, Julius Caesar, and Marcus Licinius Crassus in a conspiracy to divide governmental control among themselves, while maintaining the fiction of established governance. This arrangement worked temporarily because each member possessed assets that complemented those of his partners. Pompey's martial reputation provided the coalition with credibility and popular support. Crassus's wealth enabled the financing of campaigns and the bribery of officials whose cooperation was necessary for legislative success. Caesar's legal expertise and oratorical skills allowed the triumvirs to present their agenda in terms that appeared to respect ancient procedures while actually subverting them completely. The triumvirate's legislative program demonstrated how thoroughly established forms had been separated from established substance. Laws were passed by assemblies that had been packed with supporters, ratified by magistrates who had been bought or intimidated, and implemented by officials whose primary loyalty was to their patrons rather than to the institutions they theoretically served. Opposition was neutralized through a combination of bribery, violence, and procedural manipulation that made meaningful debate impossible. Crassus's death in 53 BC during his disastrous campaign against the Parthians destroyed the balance that had maintained the triumviral arrangement, while removing the one member whose ambitions were primarily financial rather than governmental. The remaining partners found themselves competing directly for the supreme position that neither was willing to share. The result was a final civil conflict that would determine whether the established framework could survive in any recognizable form. The breakdown of the triumvirate revealed how completely the civic structure had been transformed by a century of institutional adaptations to global realities. The state that had begun as a confederation of Italian communities, governed through consensus and compromise, had become a global empire controlled by competing martial leaders whose influence derived from their ability to reward followers and punish enemies, rather than from legitimate governance. The irony was that this transformation had been accomplished through means that were individually reasonable and collectively devastating. Each emergency had been addressed through practical solutions that violated established principles in order to preserve established government. Each successful general had used extraordinary measures to restore order and stability. Each institutional innovation had been justified as necessary to address problems that ancient methods could not solve. Yet the cumulative effect was to create a structure that retained the vocabulary and ceremonies of established government, while operating according to principles that made such government impossible. The Senate still met and debated, but its decisions carried weight only when they aligned with the interests of whatever martial leader controlled the capital. Popular assemblies still voted on legislation, but the outcomes were determined by whoever possessed the means to organize and intimidate the voters. Magistrates still held ancient offices, but their influence depended on the support of patrons whose objectives transcended any established limitations. The final emergency was approaching. Within a decade, Julius Caesar would cross the Rubicon with his army and march on the capital, beginning the civil conflict that would end with his assassination and the ultimate establishment of imperial government under Augustus. The civic structure that had conquered the Mediterranean world was about to be conquered in turn by the ambitions it had unleashed and the assets it had created. The final act of the civic drama began not with the clash of armies, but with the whispered conversations of ambitious men who understood that the old rules no longer applied. In the shadowed porticos of the capital, three figures, whose names would echo through eternity, made agreements that transformed personal rivalry into systematic conspiracy. Pompey the Great brought martial glory and public acclaim. Marcus Licinius Crassus contributed vast wealth, accumulated through property speculation and provincial exploitation. Gaius Julius offered legal brilliance and oratorical genius that could make any arrangement appear legitimate and necessary. The First Alliance, as historians would later call this secret partnership, represented something unprecedented in the civic tradition, a deliberate conspiracy to divide governmental control among private individuals while maintaining the facade of established frameworks. The conspirators understood that direct seizure of control would provoke resistance that might unite their enemies against them. Instead, they chose to work within existing structures while systematically corrupting those structures beyond recognition. Yet even before this infamous partnership was formed, the governmental framework had been showing signs of terminal weakness. The Catiline conspiracy of 63 BC had revealed how easily desperate men could organize armed rebellion within the capital itself. Lucius Sergius Catilina, a bankrupt aristocrat whose debts exceeded any hope of legal repayment, had assembled a coalition of similarly desperate individuals who planned to seize control through assassination and arson. Only the vigilance of Cicero, serving his consulship with a dedication to civic virtue that seemed almost anachronistic, had prevented the conspiracy from succeeding. Cicero's suppression of the Catilinarian plot demonstrated both the residual strength of established institutions and their growing vulnerability to subversion. His famous orations against Catiline, "How long, Catiline, will you abuse our patience?" showcased the rhetorical traditions that had made the aristocratic council a genuine deliberative body. His swift action to arrest and execute the conspirators without trial showed that decisive leadership could still preserve order when emergencies demanded immediate response. But Cicero's very success highlighted the problem that no amount of individual virtue could solve. The governmental framework depended on voluntary compliance with unwritten norms that ambitious individuals could violate whenever violations served their purposes. The conspirators learned from Catiline's failure that successful subversion required not dramatic gestures, but patient manipulation of legal procedures by individuals who possessed both the resources and the respectability to make their actions appear legitimate. The alliance's first major achievement was the election of the younger man to the consulship for 59 BC, accomplished through a combination of Crassus's financial support and the general's public influence. Once in office, the future dictator demonstrated how thoroughly the ancient office could be perverted to serve personal rather than public objectives. When his colleague Marcus Bibulus attempted to oppose the partnership's legislation, supporters used violence to drive him from the forum, effectively reducing the consulship to a one-man office for the remainder of the year. The legislation that the consul pushed through during his term established patterns that would characterize the final decades of civic government. Land distributions for the general's veterans were funded through provincial revenues that had been designated for other purposes. Eastern territorial arrangements were ratified without aristocratic scrutiny, creating precedents for executive agreements that bypassed legislative oversight. Most significantly, the consul secured for himself the governorship of Gaul, a position that would provide him with the martial reputation and personal wealth necessary to compete with his partners. The Gallic expeditions that followed transformed the future conqueror from a capable but conventional leader into something far more dangerous. A martial genius whose victories rivaled those of Alexander, and whose wealth exceeded that of entire kingdoms. The subjugation of Gaul was not merely a territorial acquisition, but a demonstration of Latin superiority over peoples who had previously been considered unconquerable. The expeditions also provided him with a laboratory for testing innovations in organization, logistics, and engineering that would prove decisive in the civil conflicts to come. The future dictator's own account of these expeditions, preserved in his commentaries, reveals a leader who understood that martial success required more than tactical brilliance. His treatment of defeated enemies combined calculated mercy with strategic terror, encouraging surrender while demonstrating the futility of resistance. His construction projects, bridges across the Rhine, fortifications around Alesia, harbour works along the Atlantic coast, showcased Latin engineering capabilities while providing practical advantages that enabled his forces to operate in territories where no Mediterranean army had previously functioned. The siege of Alesia in 52 BC, where the proconsul's forces surrounded the Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix and his army, while simultaneously defending against a relief force that outnumbered them significantly, became the supreme example of tactical innovation and organizational superiority. The double fortifications that his engineers constructed, one facing inward to contain the besieged garrison, another facing outward to repel the relieving army, demonstrated a level of logistical sophistication that no contemporary force could match. Yet the conqueror's very success in Gaul created the conditions that would make peaceful resolution of the partnership's rivalries impossible. His wealth from Gallic plunder enabled him to finance activities on a scale that threatened to overshadow his allies. His martial reputation attracted followers who valued personal loyalty over institutional allegiance. Most dangerously, his continuous leadership of veteran legions gave him resources for pursuing objectives through means that civilian leaders could not resist. The breakdown of the alliance began with Crassus's death in 53 BC during his disastrous expedition against the Parthians. The defeat at Carrhae, where Parthian horse archers destroyed an entire Latin army and captured its eagles, removed the one partner whose ambitions were primarily financial rather than governmental. Without Crassus's mediating influence, the remaining allies found themselves competing directly for supremacy in a contest that neither could afford to lose. The general's response to this new situation revealed both his limitations and his fundamental misunderstanding of the forces that the Gallic expeditions had unleashed. Rather than seeking accommodation with his former ally, he chose to align himself with the aristocratic establishment that had previously viewed him with suspicion. This alliance offered him respectability and constitutional legitimacy, but it also tied him to a cause that could not inspire the passionate loyalty that the proconsul enjoyed among his veterans and supporters. The emergency deepened when the Gallic governorship approached its legal termination, and the conqueror faced the choice between returning to private life or crossing into Italy with his army. Private life meant vulnerability to prosecution by enemies who had accumulated grievances during his consulship and Gallic expeditions. It also meant abandoning the forces whose loyalty had become central to his identity and whose welfare depended on his continued ability to provide them with rewards and advancement. The proconsul's request to stand for the consulship in absentia, which would have allowed him to transition directly from provincial leadership to civil office without the dangerous interval of private citizenship, was technically legal but unacceptable to his enemies. The aristocratic council's refusal to grant this concession, combined with their demand that he dismiss his armies and return to the capital as a private citizen, created an ultimatum that he correctly understood as an invitation to destruction. The famous crossing of the Rubicon on January 10th, 49 BC, was both a maneuver and a symbolic gesture that marked the point of no return in the conflict between personal ambition and institutional restraint. The small river that separated Cisalpine Gaul from Italy proper represented the legal boundary beyond which no general could bring armed forces without explicit authorization. When the future dictator led his 13th Legion across this boundary, he was committing an act of treason that could only be justified by complete victory over his opponents. His reported words, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast, captured the gambler's psychology that drove the final breakdown of civic government. Like a desperate player risking everything on a single throw, he was wagering his life, his reputation, and his accumulated achievements on his ability to defeat enemies who controlled the legitimate government and possessed the nominal loyalty of the established forces. The civil conflict that followed revealed how completely the traditional foundations of Latin dominance had been undermined by the changes of the previous century. The general's advantages, constitutional legitimacy, aristocratic support, control of the treasury and the eastern provinces, proved less decisive than his rival's core strengths. Veteran loyalty, organizational efficiency, and the tactical innovations developed during the Gallic expeditions. The rapidity of the advance through Italy demonstrated that sentiment favored the challenger over the establishment that had failed to address the social and economic problems created by territorial expansion. Towns opened their gates to the invaders' forces, while the defenders' supporters fled towards southern ports, abandoning the capital and the territories they claimed to protect. The psychological impact was enormous. The defenders of legitimate governance appeared to be abandoning their responsibilities, while the rebel seemed to be restoring order and confidence. The general's decision to evacuate Italy and establish his base in Greece reflected both strategic wisdom and weakness. The eastern provinces provided him with resources and allies that could enable a sustained effort against his opponent's forces. But the abandonment of the capital also symbolized the failure of traditional leadership to defend the frameworks they claimed to represent. Citizens who had been taught to revere the aristocratic council, and its legitimacy could hardly be expected to maintain that reverence when councillors themselves fled rather than fight for their principles. The Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC settled the martial outcome, but not the consequences of the civil conflict. The victor's tactical superiority and his veterans' loyalty combined to destroy the larger but less experienced opposing army in a single afternoon's fighting. The general's flight to Egypt and subsequent assassination by counselors of the young Ptolemy the 13th eliminated the most dangerous rival, while providing an opportunity to present himself as the avenger of a former ally, rather than merely the victor in a personal quarrel. The relationship with Cleopatra VII during the months in Alexandria revealed another dimension of genius: the ability to combine personal attraction with strategic calculation in ways that advanced both immediate objectives and long-term ambitions. The Egyptian queen's intelligence, ambition, and resources made her a valuable ally in consolidating control over the Eastern Mediterranean. Their romantic connection provided personal satisfaction while generating fascination that enhanced his reputation as a figure who transcended ordinary limitations. But the Egyptian sojourn also demonstrated the dangers inherent in his position as the sole source of governance in a state whose frameworks had been designed to prevent any individual from accumulating such concentrated influence. His apparent infatuation with foreign luxury and exotic customs provided ammunition for critics who argued that he had been corrupted by success and was abandoning Latin values for Oriental despotism. The rumors that he intended to move the capital to Alexandria and rule as a divine king reflected genuine fears about the ultimate direction of his ambitions. The return to the capital in 46 BC began the most creative and dangerous phase of his career. The attempt to transform the Latin state while preserving enough traditional forms to maintain legitimacy and prevent successful opposition. His clemency toward defeated enemies demonstrated both magnanimity and calculation, since mercy encouraged future cooperation, while displaying the confidence of someone who no longer feared his opponents. His public works projects, new forums, basilicas, and theatres, provided employment for urban masses, while showcasing the prosperity that his leadership had brought to the state. The calendar reform that bears his name exemplified his approach to fundamental change through technical innovation. The replacement of the traditional lunar calendar with a solar system based on Egyptian astronomical knowledge solved practical problems that had plagued administration for generations. Citizens would no longer need to worry about the gradual divergence between legal and natural seasons that had made agricultural planning difficult and religious observances uncertain. Yet this seemingly technical change also demonstrated his prerogative to restructure the most basic frameworks of civic life according to his personal judgment. The expanding use of the dictatorial office revealed both his understanding of constitutional traditions and his willingness to stretch those traditions beyond recognition when circumstances demanded. The dictatorship had been designed as a temporary expedient for handling specific emergencies that normal frameworks could not address effectively. His successive appointments to this office, first for limited terms, then for 10 years, finally for life, transformed it from an emergency measure into a permanent alternative to collective government. The accumulation of honors and titles that accompanied these appointments reflected the difficulty of finding adequate forms for unprecedented influence. He became not only dictator, but also Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, censor, and holder of various other offices that had traditionally been distributed among different individuals to prevent excessive concentration of control. His image appeared on coins while he lived, violating ancient prohibitions against depicting living persons on official currency. Statues were erected in temples alongside those of the gods, suggesting a status that transcended ordinary mortality. Yet his own attitude toward these honors remained ambiguous in ways that frustrated both supporters, who wanted him to embrace royal status, and opponents who feared that he intended to establish a monarchy. His public refusal of the crown that Mark Antony offered him during the Lupercalia festival of 44 BC was probably genuine, since formal kingship would have eliminated the constitutional fig leaves that made his position tolerable to moderate opinion. But his acceptance of other honours that were functionally equivalent to royal prerogatives suggested that he was more concerned with the reality of influence than with its traditional forms. The conspiracy that formed against him in the early months of 44 BC brought together men whose motives ranged from principled constitutional objections to personal grievances and disappointed ambitions. Marcus Junius Brutus, whose ancestor had helped found the civic order by expelling the last king, represented the idealistic wing of the conspiracy that genuinely believed his removal would restore legitimate government. Gaius Cassius Longinus, who had suffered embarrassments under the dictator's shadow, exemplified the personal resentments that his success had generated among potential rivals. The assassination itself, carried out in the council house on the Ides of March, was both a theatrical gesture and a practical attempt to eliminate the individual whose continued existence prevented any return to collective government. The conspirators' choice to strike during a meeting emphasized their claim to represent legitimate institutional governance against personal usurpation. Their decision to kill him publicly in front of his colleagues and supporters demonstrated their confidence that his removal would be welcomed by citizens who yearned for the restoration of traditional government. His reported last words, "Et tu, Brute, and you, Brutus," whether historically accurate or dramatically invented, captured the personal betrayal that made his death particularly shocking to contemporary observers. Brutus had been not merely an associate, but almost a son to the dictator, who had shown him favor and advancement despite his family's opposition to the partnership. The participation of such intimates in the conspiracy suggested that trust in personal loyalty had been fatally misplaced. Yet the immediate aftermath of the assassination revealed the conspirators' fundamental miscalculation about the realities they faced. The cheering crowds they had expected to greet his removal never materialized. Instead, they found themselves facing hostile demonstrations, loyal veteran soldiers demanding vengeance for their leader, and rivals who were prepared to exploit the vacuum that his death had created. The reading of his will, which left generous bequests to ordinary citizens and opened his gardens for public use, demonstrated how thoroughly he had understood the importance of mass support in the transformed environment. His adoption of his great-nephew Octavian provided for a succession that maintained both the family name and the coalition that his achievements had created. Most importantly, his accumulation of wealth and veterans provided his heirs with resources that no amount of constitutional legitimacy could match. The conspirators discovered that killing a tyrant was easier than killing tyranny itself. The frameworks they had hoped to restore had been so thoroughly transformed by territorial expansion and factional conflict that they could no longer function without the personal influence that the dictator had provided. The result was not the restoration of civic government, but its final collapse into the civil conflicts that would ultimately establish the imperial system under Augustus. The death of the dictator marked not the end of autocracy, but the end of any realistic possibility that the Latin state could return to the consensual government of its earlier centuries. The die had indeed been cast when he crossed the Rubicon, but the game that ended with his assassination was not merely his own survival, but the survival of the civic form of government itself. The blood of the dictator had barely dried on the steps of the council house when the conspirators discovered that assassination was easier than restoration. The governmental framework they hoped to revive had been so thoroughly transformed by a century of civil conflicts and personal rule that it could no longer function without the very concentration of influence they had murdered to eliminate. The result was not the return of ancient liberty, but the final collapse into chaos that would end only when one man emerged victorious from the wreckage of 5 centuries of civic tradition. The immediate aftermath of the Ides of March revealed the fatal naivete of the conspirators' assumptions. They had imagined that removing the dictator would automatically restore the ancient order that had existed before his rise to supremacy. Instead, they found themselves facing hostile crowds in the Forum, veteran soldiers demanding vengeance for their fallen commander, and ambitious leaders who saw opportunity in the sudden vacuum that the assassination had created. Mark Antony, the dictator's lieutenant and co-consul, emerged as the natural heir to his legacy and the loyalty of his supporters. Antony possessed the martial credentials and personal charisma necessary to command the fallen leader's veterans, but he lacked the strategic vision and administrative genius that had made his predecessor's dominance sustainable. His immediate response to the crisis, securing the state treasury and the dictator's private papers, demonstrated practical instincts, but his longer-term planning proved inadequate for the challenges that lay ahead. The reading of the will provided the first surprise in a sequence of events that would confound all contemporary expectations. Rather than naming Antony as his heir, the assassinated leader had adopted his 18-year-old great-nephew, Gaius Octavius, and left him 3/4 of his vast fortune, along with the family name that carried such enormous weight with veterans and the urban masses. The young man, who would become known to history as Octavian and later as the first emperor, seemed an unlikely candidate for the succession struggles that were about to consume the state. Yet this seemingly frail youth possessed qualities that his more experienced rivals fatally underestimated. Where Antony relied on inherited loyalties and immediate charisma, Octavian understood that lasting success required building systematic coalitions based on mutual interest rather than personal attachment. Where the conspirators assumed that ancient forms retained their traditional force, Octavian grasped that effectiveness now depended on controlling the resources, money, veterans, popular support, that determined outcomes in the transformed environment. The uneasy cooperation between Antony and Octavian during the first months after the assassination reflected their mutual need to eliminate the conspirators before addressing their own rivalries. The formation of the Second Triumvirate in 43 BC, which included Marcus Aemilius Lepidus as a third partner, represented a more systematic approach to dividing control than the informal arrangements that had characterized the earlier alliance. This time, the triumvirs obtained legal authorization for their extraordinary positions and proceeded to eliminate their enemies through methods that made Sulla's prescriptions seem restrained by comparison. The prescription lists published by the triumvirs contained the names of over 2,000 individuals marked for death, including the greatest orator of the age, Cicero, whose opposition to Antony had made him a particular target for revenge. The systematic murder of these men, senators, knights, and wealthy citizens, whose only crime was possessing resources that the triumvirs needed, or opinions they found inconvenient, demonstrated how completely the rule of law had been subordinated to personal ambition and factional hatred. Cicero's death symbolized the end of an entire tradition of governance that had depended on the force of eloquence and moral standing to influence decisions. His severed head and hands were displayed on the speaker's platform in the Forum, where he had delivered his greatest speeches, a grotesque reminder that reasoned argument could no longer compete with organized violence as a method of resolving disputes. The Battle of Philippi in 42 BC settled the immediate question of whether the conspirators could restore ancient governance through armed resistance. The defeat and suicide of Brutus and Cassius eliminated the last significant opposition to triumviral rule, while demonstrating that appeals to tradition could not motivate soldiers more effectively than promises of concrete rewards. The veterans who won this victory were fighting not for abstract principles, but for the land grants and monetary bonuses that their commanders had promised them. With their enemies destroyed, the triumvirs proceeded to divide the Mediterranean world among themselves, according to their respective strengths and ambitions. Antony received the eastern provinces, where his martial reputation and experience would enable him to pursue the conflict against Parthia that the dictator had been planning at the time of his assassination. Octavian was assigned the more challenging task of settling retired soldiers in Italy, while managing the complex problems of governing the heartland during a period of economic disruption and social upheaval. Lepidus, the weakest of the three partners, received Africa and found himself gradually marginalized as his colleagues consolidated their positions and prepared for the inevitable confrontation between them. His eventual elimination from the triumvirate in 36 BC demonstrated how easily formal agreements could be revised when one party possessed insufficient resources to enforce his claims. The decade of triumviral rule revealed the fundamental differences in temperament and strategy that would ultimately determine the outcome of the final civil conflict. Antony's approach to governing the eastern territories reflected the traditional aristocratic assumption that provincial commands existed primarily to provide wealth and glory for their holders. His relationship with Cleopatra, which began as a strategic alliance but evolved into a genuine romantic partnership, offered him access to Egyptian resources and administrative expertise. But it also exposed him to charges that he had abandoned Latin values for foreign luxuries and Oriental despotism. Octavian's management of Italian affairs demonstrated a more sophisticated understanding of the changes that territorial expansion had brought to the traditional order. His settlement of retired soldiers in new colonies provided security for former troops while creating communities of stakeholders whose prosperity depended on maintaining the new arrangement. His cultivation of popular support through public works projects and entertainments built lasting loyalty among urban masses who had been neglected by the ancient aristocracy. More importantly, Octavian surrounded himself with advisors who understood that effective governance required administrative competence as well as martial success. Marcus Agrippa provided the engineering expertise and logistical capabilities that enabled large-scale construction projects. Gaius Maecenas offered literary and cultural sophistication that attracted intellectuals and artists whose support enhanced the regime's legitimacy among educated elites. Together, they created an alternative to the traditional aristocratic networks that had dominated affairs for centuries. The propaganda effort that preceded the final confrontation revealed how thoroughly the language of ancient governance had been adapted to serve personal ambitions that violated every traditional principle. Both sides claimed to represent legitimate rule against usurpation, traditional values against foreign corruption, and the true interests of the people against factional oppression. Yet these appeals to ancient principles were deployed in support of objectives that would have been incomprehensible to the founders of the civic order. Octavian's particular genius lay in his ability to present his accumulation of unprecedented personal influence as a restoration of traditional governance rather than its replacement. His adoption of the name Caesar linked him to the popular memory of his predecessor's achievements, while avoiding the negative associations that the dictator's assassination had created. His emphasis on his role as defender of Italian interests against foreign threats appealed to xenophobic sentiments that Antony's Egyptian connections had aroused among his domestic opponents. The Battle of Actium in 31 BC was as much a social and psychological victory as a martial one. Antony's defeat resulted less from tactical incompetence than from the systematic erosion of his support base through defections by allies who had concluded that Octavian's resources and organizational advantages made his ultimate victory inevitable. The suicide of Antony and Cleopatra eliminated the last rivals for supreme control, while providing Octavian with the opportunity to present himself as the magnanimous victor who preferred mercy to revenge. The settlement that Octavian implemented after Actium demonstrated his understanding that lasting success required solving the fundamental problems that had destroyed the ancient order, rather than simply eliminating his personal enemies. The transformation of Egypt into a personal possession of the ruling family provided him with resources that no potential challenger could match. The systematic reorganization of provincial administration created career opportunities for ambitious individuals, while ensuring that their advancement depended on loyalty to the new regime, rather than traditional aristocratic connections. Most crucially, Octavian's approach to the veteran problem, the challenge of providing for retired soldiers without destabilizing civilian society, established the foundation for a professional martial structure that could defend the territories without threatening domestic peace. The creation of permanent legions with fixed terms of service and guaranteed retirement benefits eliminated the need for motivated land distributions, while ensuring that armed loyalty focused on the state rather than individual commanders. The civic settlement of 27 BC, which marked Octavian's transformation into the first emperor and the formal beginning of the new order, represented the culmination of this process of systematic renovation. The ruler's acceptance of the title princeps, first citizen, rather than rex, king or dictator, preserved the vocabulary of ancient governance while creating a form of personal rule that was more absolute than any monarch had ever enjoyed. The positions that the first emperor accumulated, proconsular command over all frontier provinces, tribunician prerogatives that enabled him to propose legislation and protect citizens from magisterial abuse, pontifical oversight of religious affairs, were individually traditional but collectively unprecedented. By combining offices that had previously been held by different individuals and extending their terms indefinitely, he created a structure of rule that maintained ancient forms while concentrating all real influence in a single person. The genius of this settlement lay in its ability to satisfy the contradictory demands that the civil conflicts had revealed. Retired soldiers received the security and rewards they had been promised without the need for further civil strife. The aristocracy retained their social status and ceremonial honors, while accepting exclusion from real decision-making. The urban masses enjoyed the entertainments and economic benefits that the ruler's wealth could provide, while surrendering the civic participation that had made their predecessors genuine citizens rather than mere subjects. Provincial populations who had suffered for generations from the rapacious exploitation of ambitious governors found themselves governed by professional administrators whose careers depended on competent performance rather than short-term profit maximization. The result was a level of prosperity and stability that the late civic period's constant warfare had made impossible. Yet the price of this peace was the end of the structure that had created the greatest empire in human history. The institutions that had enabled a small Italian city-state to conquer the Mediterranean world, competitive elections, public debate, collective decision-making, were preserved as ceremonial relics, while real influence passed to a single individual and his appointed subordinates. The Senate continued to meet and deliberate, but its discussions no longer determined state policy. Popular assemblies still voted on legislation, but the outcomes were predetermined by the emperor's preferences. Magistrates still held ancient offices, but their functions were largely ceremonial, since all important decisions were made by the new administration. The transformation was so complete that within a generation, few citizens could imagine any alternative to this new form of rule. The ancient order that had conquered the world had been replaced by an arrangement that could govern the world but could not reproduce the civic virtues that had made conquest possible. The price of stability was the death of the creative engagement that had made the state unique among ancient civilizations. The first emperor lived until 14 AD, ruling for 45 years and transforming himself from a teenage heir of a murdered dictator into the founder of a new form of rule that would endure for centuries. His achievement was remarkable, not only for its longevity, but for its apparent effortlessness. He made autocracy seem natural and inevitable, rather than imposed and artificial. Yet the very success of this new arrangement contained the seeds of problems that would eventually destroy it. The ruler's influence depended ultimately on his personal qualities, rather than institutional frameworks, creating succession crises whenever a leader died without a clearly designated heir. The professional armed forces that provided security also consumed enormous resources and could threaten the state if their loyalty wavered. Most fundamentally, the new order's efficiency and stability discouraged the civic engagement that had made the conquest of the territories possible in the first place. The young man, who had inherited a civil conflict and a collapsing state, bequeathed to his successors an empire that would endure for centuries, but a structure of rule that had lost the capacity for self-renewal that had characterized the ancient order it replaced. The die that Julius had cast when he crossed the Rubicon had finally come to rest, and the civic tradition was no more.